Picture a writing desk in a London drawing room. Sometime in the 1840s, a candle burning low, papers spread across the surface. Not a laboratory, not a university, because no university in England would admit a woman. At that desk, a woman in her mid-20s is writing instructions for a machine that does not yet exist. She is asking, in precise mathematical language, a question about the relationship between machines and human thought that researchers are still trying to answer today. Her name is Ada Lovelace. She will be dead before she turns 37. The machine she is writing about will not be built for nearly a century, and yet what she writes here will later be seen as among the earliest steps towards something that now shapes the modern world. This is her complete life. Settle in. Let the room grow quiet. Chapter 1. The world she was born into. London, in the year 1815, was a city in the grip of a transformation so rapid and so total that the people living through it had almost no reliable framework for understanding what was happening around them. The age we now call the Industrial Revolution was already well underway. Steam engines that had begun as curiosities in coal mines were powering factories across the north of England. Cities were growing faster than any plan could accommodate them. The population of London itself, already the largest city in the Western world, was expanding at a pace that made the infrastructure of the previous century look like it had been designed for an entirely different species. The intellectual world was moving with equal urgency, though in less visible ways. What we now call science was undergoing a transformation from the private hobby of wealthy gentlemen into something that looked, for the first time, like a genuine professional discipline. The Royal Institution held public lectures that drew audiences from across London's educated classes. The newly founded Astronomical Society was mapping the heavens with systematic precision. A young mathematician named Charles Babbage had just submitted his first paper to the Royal Society. He was 23 years old. The girl who would become the most important person in his intellectual life had not yet been born. Into this world, on the 10th of December, 1815, Augusta Ada Byron arrived. Her father was George Gordon Byron, the 6th Baron Byron, known to the world simply as Lord Byron, and known to the world very well indeed. He was 27 years old, and at the absolute peak of a fame that, by the standards of his era, had almost no precedent. The publication of the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812 had made him, in a matter of weeks, the most celebrated poet in England. He had walked into a literary culture primed to receive a romantic hero, and had inhabited that role with a completeness that blurred, for his admirers, and perhaps for himself, the line between the performance and the person beneath it. He was also, by the evidence of nearly every account that survived the people who knew him, genuinely difficult to live with in ways that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of exceptional people. The marriage between Byron and Annabella Milbanke had lasted barely a year. The precise reasons for its collapse are not fully documented in a way that allows historians to speak with certainty about every dimension of what occurred between them. What the historical record does support clearly is this: Annabella, a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine mathematical ability, whom Byron had privately nicknamed the Princess of Parallelograms, found the marriage untenable and left with her infant daughter in January of 1816. Byron left England 4 months later. He died in Greece in 1824. fighting in the Greek War of Independence. When Ada was 8 years old, she never knew him, not in any meaningful sense that the surviving record documents. She knew his portrait, which hung in her mother's house behind a green curtain that Annabella would occasionally draw back, as if controlled exposure to the image might serve some purpose that she could not quite name. She knew his poetry, permitted to her only in carefully selected portions. She knew him, most of all, as an absence that the people around her filled with warnings and with the particular reverence that distance gives to complicated people after they are gone. Because Annabella's response to the end of her marriage, and to the man who had ended it, was to build around her daughter a program of education and emotional management designed, with careful deliberation, to prevent Ada from becoming anything like her father. This requires some understanding of how Annabella thought about Byron's nature and what had produced it. The early 19th century did not have the vocabulary of modern psychology, but it had its own frameworks for understanding human character, and Annabella had applied those frameworks to her husband with the methodical thoroughness of a woman trained to think carefully and not easily deterred by uncomfortable conclusions. Her conclusion, as best as the surviving correspondence allows us to reconstruct it, was that Byron's instability and his genius and his self-destruction were all expressions of the same underlying disposition, a disposition she feared, with the specific fear of a parent who has looked closely at inheritance could be passed to a child. The solution she designed was mathematics. This sounds strange until you follow the logic behind it. Mathematics, in Annabella's framework, was the discipline most directly opposed to the poetic temperament she feared in her daughter's blood. It was rigorous where poetry was emotional. It dealt in certainties where poetry trafficked in ambiguities. If Ada's mind could be shaped from earliest childhood to think mathematically, the dangerous inheritance might be contained, or at least disciplined into something that would not destroy the person carrying it. What Annabella did not anticipate, and what became the central irony of everything that followed, was that her daughter's mind would take the mathematical training and do something with it that no pure mathematician would have done. Ada would combine the precision her mother gave her with the imagination her mother feared, and from that specific combination she would produce something that neither mathematics nor poetry alone could have generated, but that was years away. In 1815, in the immediate aftermath of Byron's departure and the collapse of a marriage that had briefly made Annabella a figure of public sympathy, the first task was simply to build something stable enough for a child to grow inside. Annabella managed it with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. She was not a warm woman in the demonstrative sense, by the accounts that have survived her, but she was a steady one, and for a child growing up in circumstances that could easily have produced chaos, steadiness had a value that warmth alone could not have provided. Ada would struggle against her mother's management for the rest of her life. She would rebel against it and seek independence from it and find herself, in the crises of her later years, returning to it as the only available structure when everything else had shifted. The relationship between them was not simple, and the historical record does not permit us to reduce it to either pure resentment or pure gratitude. What it does permit us to say is this: the woman Ada became the quality of her intellectual ambition, the direction of her most important work, and even the specific form that her most significant contribution took. All of it was shaped by the collision between what Annabella feared and what Ada despite everything built to contain it, refused to stop being. The drawing room was waiting. The desk was waiting. The candle had not yet been lit. But first, there was a childhood to survive. And childhoods. Even the ones that eventually produce something remarkable have a way of being considerably harder than the remarkable thing that comes after them. Chapter 2. The Absent Father and the Anxious Mother. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to children who grow up in the shadow of someone they never met. Ada Byron knew her father the way you know a myth, through other people's words, carefully selected, through glimpsed portraits behind a green curtain, in a hallway of a house that kept his memory present and managed at the same time, through the reactions of strangers who heard her last name and looked at her with an expression she learned to read before she had the language to describe it. That expression held admiration and curiosity, and a kind of inspecting attention, as if they were searching her face for the father they already knew, looking for evidence of the inheritance that everyone around her seemed both fascinated by and afraid of. Byron had been dead since 1824. Ada was 8 years old when the news arrived from Greece. The accounts of exactly how Annabella informed her daughter of his death have not survived with enough detail to allow confident reconstruction of that specific moment. What the historical record does preserve is the broader shape of what followed. There was no extended public mourning. There was, instead, the continuation of the programme Annabella had already set in motion. The lessons continued. The tutors arrived. The mathematics went on. If this sounds cold, it requires the full context of what Annabella was carrying. She was a woman who had survived a marriage that contemporary accounts describe in terms ranging from deeply difficult to genuinely frightening. She had extracted herself and her infant daughter from that marriage at considerable personal, both emotional and social. At a time when leaving a marriage placed almost all of its social consequences on the woman who chose to leave. She had then spent years managing the public narrative of what had happened while simultaneously raising a child alone, in a social environment that had strong and not always sympathetic opinions about what both of those facts said about her character. She was also a woman who had watched genuine brilliance destroy itself in real time, at close range, and had drawn specific conclusions from what she witnessed. Byron had not been a mediocre person who collapsed under ordinary pressures. He had been extraordinary in ways that even his enemies acknowledged, and he had directed that extraordinariness toward his own undoing with a consistency that Annabella, by the end of the marriage, found more frightening than anything else about him. The lesson she drew was not that brilliance was dangerous in itself. The lesson was that brilliance without discipline was dangerous, and discipline, the kind that could hold a gifted mind accountable for its own behaviour, was what mathematics trained. So, Ada had mathematics. She had it early, and she had it systematically, delivered by a sequence of tutors that Annabella selected with the care of someone building a structure that needed to bear real weight. Annabella's household correspondence from this period, portions of which have been examined by biographers drawing on the family archive, suggests a rigorous educational routine organised around mathematics and science and languages, with Annabella monitoring each tutor's reports and questioning them about the depth rather than merely the pace of Ada's progress. What Ada did not have, through much of this childhood, was other children. This is not a small absence, and it shaped the person she became in ways that go beyond the ordinary marks of childhood solitude. The social learning that happens in the daily friction of shared space with peers builds a different kind of intelligence than formal education does. Those who knew Ada in her adult life noted, not unkindly, that she could be startlingly direct in situations that called for diplomatic indirection, that she sometimes misread the emotional weather of a room that her formal intelligence would have analysed correctly if presented to her as a problem on paper. These are the marks of a specific kind of formation, one that built one kind of mind at the expense of another. Annabella monitored everything. She kept careful records of Ada's progress. She corresponded with tutors about her daughter's intellectual development with a level of engagement that would have been unusual even for a father of that era. She questioned them about Ada's reasoning, about where she struggled, about whether the foundations were being laid with sufficient rigour. The accounts that have survived through biographers working with the family archive suggest that several tutors found Ada's curiosity difficult to contain within the ordinary structure of a lesson, that she pressed questions further than the assigned material required, and that this quality produced in Annabella something between pride and renewed anxiety about what it might mean. And Ada, growing up inside this structure, did what children inside structures always do. She looked for the places where the structure had gaps. The gaps were not difficult to find, because the structure, however carefully designed, could not contain the specific quality of Ada's imagination. Annabella had built the educational program to discipline a mind she feared was too much like Byron's. What she had not fully anticipated was that the discipline was doing something to Ada's imagination rather than simply replacing it. It was giving her imagination a precision it would not otherwise have possessed. It was teaching her to build structures in her mind that could bear the weight of actual testing, that could be evaluated against reality rather than simply admired for their beauty. The combination was unusual, and it was already visible to anyone paying close attention before Ada had reached her teenage years. Annabella was paying close attention. She saw it. Whether she felt something closer to wonder than anxiety in those moments when Ada's thinking exceeded what the lesson had set out to produce. The surviving correspondence approaches, but does not fully answer. What the letters do show is that Annabella's concern about Ada never fully resolved into simple confidence. Even as the evidence of Ada's genuine ability accumulated year by year, Ada, who understood this anxiety in the bone-deep way that children understand the things their parents cannot stop communicating, carried the weight of it into every room she ever entered. She was not, despite all of this, a crushed child. The portrait that assembles itself from the early accounts is of someone with a genuine spark that the structure around her compressed but could not extinguish. There were moments of rebellion, small and then larger. There were moments of genuine intellectual delight, visible even in the formal records kept by her tutors, when a lesson opened into something unexpected, and Ada followed it with a quality of attention that her teachers described in terms that went beyond the ordinary language of pedagogy. The mathematical training her mother had built was real and rigorous. So was the imagination her mother feared. Both were growing, and neither one, it was becoming clear to anyone who observed the combination closely, was going to yield to the other. Chapter 3. The Mind That Would Not Stay Still. When Ada was 12 years old, she decided to design a pair of wings. This is documented in her own letters from the period and referenced by her biographers, drawing on the family archive with enough consistency to treat as well established. She called the project, in her own notes, Flyology, and the name, with its combination of the fanciful and the systematic, tells you almost everything you need to know about the quality of mind that produced it. She began by studying birds, not in the casual way of a child watching sparrows in a garden, but with the deliberate attention of someone who had been taught that observation without rigour produces nothing useful. Her letters from this period describe examining wing structures and thinking through the relationship between wingspan and body weight, and considering how different birds used different techniques for different purposes. She took notes. She drew diagrams. Then she began designing. What she was working toward was not a fantasy. It was an engineering problem. Approached with the tools she had available, she thought about materials. She considered how a human body, with its particular weight and its particular centre of gravity, would need to be positioned relative to a wing structure to achieve anything resembling controlled movement through air. She thought about the translation of muscular effort into directional force. She intended, her letters suggest, to write a book about the findings. The book was never written. The project was interrupted when Ada fell seriously ill, as she would several times throughout her childhood and young adulthood. The illness that interrupted phlyology was severe enough to affect her eyesight and to leave her largely confined to her room across much of her 13th and 14th years. Biographers working with the correspondence from this period note that the illness was prolonged and debilitating, that the tutor's visits became irregular, and that the educational routine Annabella had built so carefully was significantly disrupted for an extended period. Annabella's letters from this time carry a quality different from her more organized correspondence, something that does not hide entirely behind the careful sentences, a quality of fear that the sustained illness of a child produces in a parent who has already lost so much to forces outside her control. Ada lay in that room for months and thought. She thought the way that active minds in inactive bodies tend to think, following ideas further than they would have gone if there had been other demands on her attention. With the long, unhurried chains of reasoning that only enforced stillness makes possible, she could not do mathematics in any formal sense without her tutors and without the physical energy that sustained study requires. But she could ask questions. She could hold a problem at the edge of her attention for hours and turn it slowly and press on the places where it resisted. She recovered. Across the course of her 14th and 15th years, slowly and incompletely, her eyesight remained compromised for a period. Accounts from this time indicate she used crutches for longer than anyone had initially expected. Her health would be unstable for the rest of her life. A recurring vulnerability that she managed with varying degrees of success, and that the medical approaches available to her time did not reliably improve. But the mind came back, and with it, the hunger. She returned to mathematics with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. And she found, returning to it from the other side of a period when the most basic questions about her own future had been genuinely uncertain, that her relationship to it had shifted in a way she could not precisely name. Before the illness, mathematics had been the structure her mother had built around her. Returning to it now, she found that it had become something else as well, something she chose, something that was hers in a way that the prescribed curriculum had not been, because choosing it after everything the illness had cost her made it hers in a way that being assigned it never could. Her tutor in these years of recovery was Mary Somerville, and the significance of that choice shaped Ada's development in ways that went far beyond anything Annabella had specifically planned for. Mary Somerville was, by the early 1830s, the most prominent woman of science in Britain. Her translation and substantial expansion of a major work of celestial mechanics had been published in 1831 and received not merely as competent translation but as genuine intellectual contribution. She corresponded with the leading scientific figures of her era as a peer. Her social position in London's intellectual circles was established in a way that no other woman of science in Britain could claim. For Ada, the significance of Somerville was not only the mathematics she taught, it was what Somerville represented by existing. Here was a woman who had done serious work and been taken seriously for it, who had moved through the intellectual world of London and been received there as someone whose thinking mattered. The possibility that Ada's own mathematical ambitions could have a real destination, rather than remaining a private discipline with no outward expression, became visible through Somerville in a way it could not have become visible through any of the tutors who had preceded her. Somerville introduced Ada to Charles Babbage in June of 1833. Ada was 17 years old. The drawing room where they met, the conversation that followed, the questions Ada asked about a machine she had just seen for the first time. That story belongs to the next chapter, but its roots are here, in the room where Ada lay still for months and thought, in the return to mathematics as something chosen rather than imposed, in the encounter with Somerville as a living demonstration that a woman's serious mind could find serious work in a world that had not been designed to receive it. Ada's mind had survived everything her childhood had delivered. It was. By the time she walked into that party in June of 1833, one of the most unusual minds in London, not because it was the most powerful or the most formally trained, though it was genuinely formidable by any reasonable standard, but because of what it combined, the precision of someone who had spent years on rigorous mathematics sat alongside an imagination that had been designing flight systems at 12 and following questions through months of enforced stillness at 13. The discipline her mother had built was real. So was the inheritance her mother feared. In a room in London, on an evening in early summer, that combination was about to meet a problem large enough to deserve it. The desk was waiting. The candle was ready. Chapter 4. The Salon and the Machine. There is a specific kind of recognition that happens between certain minds at first meeting. It is not friendship. Not yet. It is something more like the sudden awareness that a conversation you have been trying to have your entire life, without knowing quite what form it would take, or who could have it with you, has just become possible. The historical accounts of Ada's first meeting with Charles Babbage agree on the basic facts. She was 17. He was 51. Somerville made the introduction. And Babbage, by his own later account, found in this particular young visitor a quality of attention that he had not encountered before in the many people who had come to see his work. Babbage was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, not an easy man to encounter for the first time. He was brilliant, and he understood that he was brilliant, and the understanding had not made him modest. He had feuded with the Royal Society and with government funding committees and with neighbours, and had documented his views on street musicians with more energy than most people bring to questions of genuine importance. He was also, and this mattered far more than any of the rest of it, working on something that no one else in the world was working on. He was building, or attempting to build, a machine that could calculate, not in the loose metaphorical sense in which we sometimes speak of machines thinking, in the precise literal sense, a mechanical device that would receive a mathematical problem and produce a correct answer through the movement of physical components, without the intervention of a human hand at any stage where error could enter. The device Babbage had been developing since the early 1820s was called the difference engine. Mathematical tables, of the kind used by navigators and engineers and insurance companies and astronomers, were produced in Babbage's era by human workers whose job title was literally computer. People working through long sequences of arithmetic by hand. The error rate in those tables was significant, and the consequences were real. Ships had been navigated by tables containing mistakes. Engineering calculations had been built on figures that no one had successfully checked because the checking process was subject to the same human fallibility as the original computation. Babbage's difference engine would remove the human hand from that process entirely. A machine, once set in motion, would compute and record its results without any point at which human error could enter. By 1833, the difference engine was not finished and would not be finished. The relationship between Babbage and the engineer responsible for its construction had collapsed in a dispute that damaged both parties. Government funding had been suspended. The completed portion of the machine, a demonstration section that Babbage kept in his drawing room and showed to visitors, was a proof of concept rather than a working instrument, and Babbage, characteristically, had already moved past it in his thinking. While the difference engine was stalling, he had begun designing something far more ambitious. He called it the Analytical Engine. Where the difference engine was designed to perform a specific type of calculation repeatedly, the Analytical Engine was designed to perform any calculation that could be specified in advance through a sequence of instructions. It would accept those instructions on punched cards, a mechanism he adapted from the Jacquard loom that had been using punched cards to control pattern weaving since the early years of the century. It could, depending on the results of its own previous computations, modify the sequence of operations it performed. In every essential conceptual sense, it was what we would now call a computer. When Babbage showed Ada the demonstration section of the difference engine that June evening, her response was different from the responses he usually received. Most visitors were impressed by the craftsmanship. They admired the precision of the interlocking parts and the visual elegance of calculation made physical. They understood it as a remarkable engineering achievement and left it at that. Ada understood it as a beginning. The questions she asked, as Babbage later described the conversation in his memoir, were not questions about how the machine worked mechanically, though she asked those too. They were questions about what the machine could become, about the boundary between the calculations it could perform and the ones it could not, about whether the principle that made the difference engine possible could be generalized, extracted from its specific application and made into something more fundamental. Babbage wrote that she was the only person who had immediately and fully understood what he was attempting. Given that he had been trying to explain his ideas to London's intellectual community for more than a decade with mixed results, this observation carries weight. The desk was still, the candle was still, and somewhere in the thinking that Ada took home from that party, something had begun that would not stop. She was 17 years old, and she had just encountered a problem large enough for everything she had been unknowingly building toward. The mathematical discipline her mother had built, the imaginative reach that philology had demonstrated at 12, the fearlessness about the gap between what existed and what might exist, that the months of enforced stillness had deepened rather than extinguished. Her letters from the weeks that followed suggest an engagement that was immediate and serious. Questions being worked through and written down and sent to Somerville, and to anyone else who might help her pursue them further. What is the relationship between a machine and a thought? She did not yet have the tools to answer it. She would spend the next several years acquiring them, through continued mathematical study, through correspondence with Babbage that grew steadily more substantive, through the reading she pursued with the intensity of someone who understands they are building towards something specific, even when they cannot yet name what it will be. Babbage, for his part, recognized what he had encountered. He began corresponding with Ada. He sent her materials about the Analytical Engine. He answered her questions with the thoroughness he reserved for people he considered genuine intellectual peers, a category that, for Babbage, was not large, the salon culture of London, the network of drawing rooms and dinner parties where the intellectual life of the city was conducted for those with access to it, was the medium through which their collaboration began to develop. It was an imperfect medium, shaped by class and gender and the particular social anxieties of an era changing faster than its structures could accommodate. Ada navigated it with the directness that her unusual childhood had produced, sometimes smoothly and sometimes not, but always with the underlying seriousness that the people worth knowing in those rooms recognized and responded to. She was becoming known. In that limited world, as someone whose questions were worth hearing, the machine was waiting. The question was deepening, and the world, as it was about to demonstrate, had its own plans for anyone it found moving too freely toward answers it had not prepared a place for. Chapter 5. Marriage, Motherhood, and the Mathematics she would not abandon. On the 8th of July, 1835, Ada Byron married William King, who would become, 3 years later, the first Earl of Lovelace. She was 19 years old. He was 30. William King was, by the accounts that have survived from people who knew him, a man of genuine good character, substantial property, and real affection for the woman he was marrying. These qualities were not always found together in the aristocratic marriages of his era, and they deserve acknowledgment before anything else about this marriage is examined. He was not an intellectual in the sense that Ada was. His interests tended toward the practical management of his estates, rather than toward the speculative questions that consumed Ada's attention. He also had, and this mattered enormously for the life Ada was able to build inside the marriage, a genuine willingness to accommodate his wife's intellectual work in ways that the era did not require of him and did not particularly encourage. The correspondence from this period, and the accounts of people who knew both of them, indicate that William provided Ada with a study in each of their residences, a room of her own with a desk, and the shelving her growing collection of mathematical and scientific texts required. He managed the social obligations of their position in ways that gave her working time when she asked for it. He read the things she gave him to read, with care, if not always with full comprehension, because she had given them to him, and that was reason enough. In 1835, England, a woman's intellectual ambitions were legally and socially subordinate to her husband's preferences in ways that had no equivalent for men. William King could have made Ada's mathematical work impossible without anyone in his world considering him to have done anything wrong. He chose not to, and that choice, quiet and undramatic as it was, shaped everything that followed. The first years of the marriage were also the years of the children. Byron Noel King, named in part for the grandfather he would never know, was born in May of 1836. Anne Isabella King arrived in September of 1837. Ralph Gordon King in July of 1839. 3 children in less than 4 years. In an era when childbirth and its aftermath placed demands on women's bodies that modern medicine has substantially reduced, Ada's health, already unstable since the illness of her early teens, was further strained by the pregnancies. Her letters from this period describe cycles of incapacity followed by recovery, periods when serious intellectual work was not possible, followed by periods when she returned to it with a determination that people who received those letters found striking. She worked in the early mornings, before the children were awake. In the evenings, after the household had settled, in the stretches of afternoon when her health permitted and the domestic demands briefly relented, the desk William had provided, positioned near the window in whichever residence they occupied, was where she returned again and again to the questions that the domestic life around her could interrupt but could not extinguish. She studied, during these years, with Augustus de Morgan, one of the foremost mathematicians in England. By correspondence, de Morgan's assessments of Ada's mathematical ability, preserved in letters he wrote to Annabella because he felt he could not write such things directly to Ada without violating the conventions of his era, are worth pausing over carefully. He told Annabella that Ada's questions were not the questions of someone learning the subject. They were the questions of someone who had already moved through the surface of a topic and was pressing on the deeper structures underneath. He wrote that if Ada had been a man, and if her mathematical education had begun with the advantages available to men of her class and ability, she would have had the potential to become an original mathematical investigator of the first order. He wrote this in a private letter to her mother because the conventions of his era did not provide him with a way to say it to the person it was about. Ada continued working. She was not willing to reach the point where the return became impossible. The questions she had been building toward since the evening she met Babbage in Somerville's drawing room were not questions she was capable of setting aside because the household was demanding, or the children were young, or the social calendar was full. Babbage visited. The conversations about the Analytical Engine continued and deepened. The machine was still in design, still evolving, still the central preoccupation of a man who was no longer receiving government funding and who had a tendency to redesign components of the machine while previous components were still being worked through. Ada was, perhaps, by the late 1830s, the person in his intellectual circle whose understanding of the Analytical Engine's conceptual foundations was most complete, whose grasp of what it was at its deepest level came closest to matching Babbage's own. She was also developing, through those years of constrained work, a clarity about what she wanted to do with that understanding. Not merely to learn about the machine, not merely to appreciate its significance, to write about it in a way that would communicate its meaning to a world that had not yet grasped what it was looking at. The opportunity to do that was close. The desk was still there. The window still offered its light. The papers were accumulating on the shelves, building towards something Ada could sense approaching, even if she could not yet see its exact shape. Chapter 6. Babbage's Dream and Ada's Translation. In the autumn of 1840, Charles Babbage travelled to Turin to deliver a series of lectures on the Analytical Engine. He was 58 years old. The machine he had been designing for nearly 2 decades still did not exist in complete physical form. British government funding had been withdrawn. The engineering partnership that had once seemed capable of translating the design into reality had collapsed years earlier. The scientific establishment in London had, with a few notable exceptions, moved on from the analytical engine as a live concern. But in Turin, something different happened. The Italian scientific community received Babbage with a seriousness he had not encountered in England for some time. The lectures drew genuine intellectual engagement from mathematicians and engineers who asked real questions and followed the answers into the deeper implications that Babbage had been exploring largely alone. Among those present was a young military engineer and mathematician named Luigi Federico Menabrea, who listened to the lectures with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was hearing and recognized its significance. Menabrea took careful notes. He organized them into a paper that he published in French in 1842 in a Swiss scientific journal. The paper described the analytical engine's mechanical operations with reasonable precision. It communicated the basic principles of how the machine would receive instructions and produce results. It was, as far as it went, a faithful and competent account. Someone in London's scientific circles noticed the paper and thought of Ada. The suggestion was made that she might translate it from French into English. It was a reasonable suggestion for a reasonable task. A translation, something that would contribute to the diffusion of important ideas without requiring original intellectual work from the person doing it. Ada agreed to translate the paper. Then she read it carefully. What she found was accurate as far as it went, which was not as far as it needed to go. The paper described the mechanics of the machine. It did not address what the machine was, not just what it could calculate, but what it meant to have a machine that could be instructed to calculate anything that could be precisely specified. Not just the operations, but the conceptual architecture that made those operations possible, and what that architecture followed far enough into its own implications. Led to, the paper described the surface. Ada could see the depth beneath it. She wrote to Babbage. She had translated the paper. She told him. She had also added some notes. When Babbage read the notes, he told Ada she should have written an original paper rather than annotating someone else's. The notes, he said, were more important than the paper they accompanied. He suggested she expand them. She expanded them. What began as a translation exercise became, over the following months of intensive work, one of the most discussed documents in the history of computing. The notes Ada produced, identified in the published version by the letters A through G, were nearly 3 times the length of the Menabrea paper they accompanied. They were published in 1843 in an English scientific journal called Taylor's Scientific Memoirs, attributed only to the initials AAL, because Ada, working in a world with specific ideas about women and serious scientific publication, chose a partial anonymity that would allow the work to be received on its own terms before it was received on hers. The months of composition were the most intellectually demanding of her life, and, by her own account in letters from the period, among the most physically taxing as well. She worked long hours. She pushed through the health difficulties that had shadowed her since childhood. She corresponded with Babbage constantly, sometimes several letters in a single day, working through technical questions that the surviving correspondence documents in precise detail. Those letters also reveal something important about the nature of the collaboration. It was not always smooth. Babbage and Ada disagreed, on occasion with considerable force, about the content and emphasis of the notes. Babbage wanted to include a statement about the history of the government's treatment of his funding applications that Ada felt was inappropriate in a scientific paper and would damage the reception of the work. She held firm. He pressed. She held firm again. The statement did not appear in the final publication. This matters because it complicates the version of the collaboration that some later accounts have presented, in which Ada was primarily a vehicle for Babbage's ideas, rather than an independent thinker. The correspondence does not support that version. What it supports is a genuine intellectual partnership between two people with different strengths and different judgments, in which Ada's contributions were her own, and her independence of mind was documented and real. The paper was finished in the late summer of 1843. It was sent to the printer. It appeared in Taylor's Scientific Memoirs under those three initials. The desk was quiet. The papers were stacked and sent. Then, in the way that truly original work sometimes does when it arrives before the world is ready for it, the notes moved into a silence that would last for nearly 100 years. The candle had been worth burning. The desk had been worth sitting at through all those hours before dawn. The world simply needed time to arrive at the place where it could understand what had been placed before it. Chapter 7. Notes A through G. The document that invented the future. To understand what Ada actually wrote in those notes, it helps to set aside, at least briefly, the weight of historical significance that has accumulated around them. The significance is real, and we will return to it. But significance, applied from the outside and after the fact, has a way of making things feel inevitable that were not inevitable at all. What Ada wrote was not inevitable. It was a choice, made under specific conditions, by a specific person, and the choices deserve to be examined directly. The notes run from A to G. They are not uniform in character or purpose. Some are primarily technical, working through the mechanical operations of the analytical engine in greater detail than Menabrea's paper had provided. Some are conceptual, addressing the principles that underlie the mechanics, and some ask questions about the nature and limits of the machine that go beyond anything the engineering alone would have prompted. Note A begins by drawing the distinction between the analytical engine and the difference engine with a precision that Menabrea had not achieved. The difference engine could do one thing repeatedly and do it reliably. The analytical engine could do many things. Different things. Things that could be specified in advance through a system of instructions that the machine would execute in sequence. This distinction was fundamental to understanding what made the new design significant, and Ada developed it with a clarity that made the conceptual leap visible to anyone reading carefully. Notes B through E work through specific operational aspects of the machine. How it would store numbers, how it would move numbers between storage and its processing mechanism, how the sequence of operations would be controlled through the punched card system adapted from the Jacquard loom. These sections are technically dense, and they reward the slow and careful reading that follows each step and asks whether the logic holds throughout. The logic holds. This is what De Morgan had meant when he described Ada to Annabella as having the potential for original mathematical investigation. The notes move through complex material without losing the thread, without the evasions that characterize work that has understood things partially and hopes the reader will not notice. Then there is Note G. Note G is where the history turns. Note G contains what many historians of computing have described as the first published algorithm intended for execution by a machine. The qualification matters, and Ada herself would have insisted on it. An algorithm is a systematic procedure for solving a problem, a precise sequence of steps that, if followed correctly, will produce a correct result. What Ada wrote in Note G was an algorithm for computing the Bernoulli numbers, a mathematically significant sequence that appears in number theory and analysis in ways that made it a meaningful and substantive test case for computational methods. She worked through the algorithm with a completeness and precision that a computer scientist reading it today can follow step by step, identifying in its structure the elements that any algorithm requires, the inputs, the operations to be performed on those inputs, the conditions that determine whether the computation continues or terminates, the outputs it was intended to run. Ada computed it by hand to verify it before writing it down, holding herself to the standard of something that would actually work, rather than something that merely appeared to work. Take a moment with that. A woman in London in 1843, working by candlelight at a desk in a drawing room, verifying by hand an algorithm for a machine that did not yet exist, holding herself to a standard of correctness that the machine would one day be able to confirm. The machine was a century away. The standard was already there. But Note G is not primarily significant because it contains an algorithm. What makes it significant, and what makes the surrounding notes significant, is the conceptual framework within which the algorithm sits. Because in those same notes, Ada wrote something that no one had written before. She wrote about the limits of the machine. She wrote, with careful precision, that the analytical engine had no power to originate anything. It could only do what its operators knew how to order it to perform. This statement, which is sometimes summarized as Ada claiming that machines cannot think, was actually more specific and more interesting than that summary suggests. She was not saying that machines were unimportant. She had just spent months articulating the extraordinary range of things the analytical engine could be instructed to accomplish. She was making a precise claim about the nature of the relationship between the machine and the human mind operating it. The machine extended human capability in ways that were genuinely extraordinary. But the extension was an extension of what the human operator already understood well enough to specify. The machine could not generate new understanding on its own. It could only execute understanding that already existed in a form precise enough to be expressed as instructions. This statement has been in active philosophical dispute since Alan Turing addressed it directly in his landmark 1950 paper on computing, machinery, and intelligence, where he named it Lady Lovelace's objection and treated it as the most substantive challenge to the possibility of machine intelligence that had been articulated anywhere in the available literature. The question of whether a machine can produce something genuinely new, whether artificial intelligence can generate understanding rather than simulate it, is a question that Ada placed on the table in 1843 and that has not been resolved by the decades of research that have followed. She placed it on the table not as a settled answer, but as a genuine question with a real argument on one side and a genuine uncertainty on the other. She was not confident that machines would always be limited in the way she described. She was describing what she understood to be true of the machine as Babbage had designed it, and leaving open, implicitly but clearly, the question of what would need to change for that description to no longer hold. That implicit question has been the engine of an entire field of inquiry for the better part of a century. The notes also contain moments of a different kind. passages where Ada's combination of mathematical precision and imaginative reach produces writing that sounds unlike anything else in the scientific literature of her era. She wrote about the possibility that the analytical engine could be used to compose music. If the underlying relationships between notes could be expressed mathematically, she observed that the machine could operate on any symbols according to any rules, not only numbers, and that this generality was what distinguished it most fundamentally from all previous calculating devices. She was describing, in language that the era did not yet have technical vocabulary for, the concept of a general-purpose computer, a device whose physical structure was fixed but whose function was entirely determined by the instructions it received, and which could therefore perform, in principle, any operation that could be reduced to a sequence of precisely specified steps. This was a larger idea than Babbage had articulated in those specific terms. He had designed it as a calculating engine, a remarkably flexible and powerful one, but a calculating engine. Ada saw it as something whose implications extended far beyond the calculation of numbers into any domain where relationships could be expressed symbolically and rules could be stated precisely. She saw this in 1843. The notes were published. The initials AAL appeared at the bottom. The paper found its small audience and circulated in the limited world of people who had both the access and the technical background to follow it. Ada wrote to Babbage after the publication. She had ideas about further work. She was already looking at the next question. She was 27 years old. The desk was still there. The candle was still burning. The question she had opened was waiting, patient as mathematics, for the world to arrive at the place where it could understand what had been placed before it. That world was still 100 years away, but the question was not going anywhere, and neither, not yet, was Ada. Chapter 8. The Gambler, the Laudanum, and the Unraveling. There is a version of Ada Lovelace that is considerably easier to tell than the one that actually existed. In that easier version, she moves from the publication of the notes in 1843 directly toward further achievement. The complications of her personal life smoothed into the background, the darker dimensions of her character either omitted entirely or explained away as the understandable consequences of the era she was living in. The visionary part remains intact. The insights are preserved. The mind continues its work, uninterrupted by anything so human as failure. That version is not dishonest in what it includes. The visionary part is real. The insights were genuine, but it is dishonest in what it leaves out, and leaving it out does not honour Ada. It replaces her with a symbol, and symbols, however useful for certain purposes, cannot teach us what actual people teach us. The actual person, with the contradictions fully present, is worth more than the symbol, precisely because the contradictions are where the truth lives. So this is the chapter that the easier version skips. In the years following the publication of the notes, Ada gambled, not casually, not as the occasional social entertainment that horse racing represented for many people of her class. The surviving correspondence from this period, examined by biographers working with the family archive, documents a pattern of financial concealment and management through intermediaries that developed gradually into something she found difficult to address openly. The debts were real. The people drawn into managing them were real. The letters that pass between Ada and the friends involved in her affairs carry a weight that is different from the ordinary weight of social correspondence. The timing of this sits alongside other significant developments in ways that the honest account cannot pass over. The publication of the notes had not produced the recognition Ada had hoped for. There was no wave of response from the scientific community, no turning of serious attention toward what she had written and what it meant. The paper had circulated in its small world and generated modest professional notice, and then settled into the archive where most published science goes, present and available and largely unread by the people who would have most benefited from reading it. She had spent months of the most intense intellectual work of her life on something she understood to be genuinely important, and had received in return a silence that was not hostile but was, in some ways, harder to bear than hostility would have been. She was also, in these same years, dealing with health that had been inconsistent since childhood and was now becoming more seriously compromised. The treatments available to her, the medicine of the 1840s, included laudanum, a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol, as a standard response to a wide range of conditions, from chronic pain to what the era called nervous complaints. Laudanum was legal, widely recommended by physicians, and available without the restrictions that later understanding of its properties would eventually produce. It was also, as the people who used it extensively would come to understand, capable of producing dependency in ways that the medical framework of the time did not yet have the vocabulary to properly describe or address. The surviving correspondence suggests Ada's use increased during periods of physical and psychological difficulty, and that the substance became connected, over time, to the management of states that were becoming harder to manage by other means. The precise extent of this cannot be documented with clinical certainty from the materials available, and the honest account acknowledges that limit. She also developed, during these years, a project she and several associates described as a system for predicting outcomes in horse racing through mathematical analysis. The letters that document this project suggest genuine intellectual engagement with the framing of the problem alongside the financial stakes attached to it. Whether the mathematical ambition and the compulsive element were entirely separate forces or something more intertwined is a question the surviving record raises without answering definitively. The system did not work. The losses accumulated. The concealment required more energy and more involvement from more people as the amounts involved grew larger. William knew less than he might have, which was the result of deliberate management on Ada's part rather than his indifference. Annabella, whose watchful attention had never fully relaxed, knew more. The correspondence between mother and daughter during these years carries a quality different from anything in the earlier letters. Not the managed anxiety of a mother overseeing a daughter's education, something raw and more direct. Two people who loved each other. Writing through a difficulty they were finding it hard to name clearly, even to each other. The debts were eventually addressed through the involvement of people around her and the disclosure to William that concealment had made necessary. His response, so far as the surviving record shows, was more measured than the situation might have prompted in a less patient man. The marriage continued, but Ada's health was by this point moving in a direction that no resolution of the financial situation could reverse. The illness that had been building for years was becoming something that the medicine of her time could no longer contain, or even adequately name. There is a question underneath all of this that the honest account is obliged to sit with rather than answer too quickly. Whether the same qualities that produced the notes on the Analytical Engine, the intensity that would not accept ordinary limits, the belief that a system could be found if the analysis were precise enough, were in some way connected to the qualities that produced the gambling and the concealment. The surviving record raises this as a possibility without permitting a confident conclusion. It is worth holding as a question rather than resolving as an answer. Because Ada herself was too complicated and the evidence too incomplete to support anything more certain than that, the drawing room was still there. The desk was still there. The candle was burning differently now, shorter, less certain, with a quality that the people who loved her were beginning to notice and did not yet know how to speak about directly. Chapter 9. The Last Collaboration. In the spring of 1851, Ada Lovelace attended the Great Exhibition in London's Hyde Park. She was 35 years old. She walked through the Crystal Palace with a cane, her health by this point visibly compromised in ways that could not be attributed to a temporary illness or a difficult season. The diagnosis that would formally name what was happening to her body had not yet been delivered, but the people who knew her well were looking at her with the careful attention of people who are trying to understand something they are not yet ready to accept. The Crystal Palace itself was extraordinary by any standard of its era, a structure of glass and iron covering more than 19 acres of Hyde Park, housing the accumulated technological achievement of the Industrial Revolution, organized into a single, enormous space. Steam, engines the size of small buildings. Power looms running at speeds that made the individual motions invisible, producing in an hour what had once taken days. Nearly 6 million visitors over 5 months. People who came from across Britain and from abroad to stand before machines that were changing the world they lived in. Ada moved through those halls with the particular quality of attention that had always characterized her engagement with machinery, looking not only at what the machines were doing, but at what the machines implied. The gap between what the exhibition celebrated and what Babbage had been trying to build was visible to anyone who understood both sides of it. These machines were powerful and specific. The machine Babbage had designed could, in principle, be instructed to operate any process that could be specified as a sequence of steps. That idea, which Ada had spent the best months of her working life articulating, was not on display anywhere in the Crystal Palace. It was in the archive. It was waiting. She and Babbage continued to meet during these final years. The surviving correspondence from this period suggests that Ada's intellectual engagement remained genuine and serious even as her physical condition deteriorated. She had not stopped asking questions. Her letters from these months contain references to projects she was planning, directions she wanted to pursue, questions she had identified and not yet had the time or the resources to properly address. The specific plans are incompletely documented, letters that gesture toward things without fully describing them, conversations summarized rather than recorded. What comes through is the texture of a mind still in motion in a body that was no longer able to keep pace with it. The diagnosis, when it came, was cancer of the uterus. Ada was 35 years old, and the disease was, by the standards of the medicine available to her, not treatable in any meaningful sense. What her physicians could offer was management of the symptoms, which, in the practice of the time, meant increasing doses of the opiates she had already been using for years, with the complicated effects on her clarity and her capacity for sustained thought that those doses produced. The final months were spent largely at the house at Great Cumberland Place. Annabella had organized the sick room with the methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. The windows faced south and caught the afternoon light. There were books on the shelves nearby. The mathematical and scientific texts that had accumulated across Ada's adult life, present in the room, even when she could no longer work from them in any sustained way. Annabella was there. The relationship between mother and daughter, complicated across Ada's entire life by the specific combination of genuine love and genuine damage that close relationships under conditions of high anxiety tend to produce, reached something in those final months that the surviving letters suggest was more honest than much of what had come before. The managed distance that had characterized so much of their interaction gave way to something raw and more direct. They had been in each other's lives for 36 years. The things that had never been fully said were running out of time to be said. William was there. He managed the household and the children and the medical arrangements with the steadiness that had characterized his support for Ada across 17 years of marriage. His grief, visible in the letters he wrote after her death, was quiet and real, and the kind that does not translate easily into the dramatic forms that public mourning tends to take. Babbage visited. The accounts of their final meetings are not documented with enough detail to allow confident reconstruction of what passed between them in those hours. What the historical record does support is that the friendship, which had been the most consequential intellectual relationship of both their lives, was maintained to the end. He would outlive Ada by nearly 2 decades. He would never finish the Analytical Engine. He would continue to work on it until his own death in 1871. In the rooms of his house on Dorset Street, where the drawings and the partial components had accumulated across 4 decades of effort that the world had not known how to support, in the summer of 1852, Ada asked to be buried beside her father. This request has been interpreted differently by different people who have written about her, as a final claiming of the connection that had been managed and kept at a careful distance for her entire life, as something simpler and harder to articulate, the wish of a person who is dying to rest beside the person whose absence had shaped her most fundamentally, the person she had never known and had always, in some way she could not fully name, been trying to understand. She died on the 27th of November, 1852. She was 36 years old. Byron had died at 36, in Greece, in the service of something he believed in. Ada died in London, in that room at Great Cumberland Place, in the city where she had done the work that would outlast everything else about her era. The desk in the study was empty now. The papers were still. The correspondence had stopped. The notes she had published 9 years earlier were sitting in the archive of Taylor's scientific memoirs, under 3 initials, patient as the mathematics they were written in, waiting for a world that had not yet arrived at the place where it could read them and understand what it was reading. That world was still 100 years away. The notes were not going anywhere. Chapter 10. Death at 36, and the silence that followed. There is a particular kind of silence that descends after a remarkable person dies young. It is not the silence of immediate forgetting. The people who had known Ada Lovelace were still alive and still working. Babbage was still designing. Somerville was still corresponding with scientists across Europe. De Morgan was still teaching mathematics at University College London. William was still managing the estates and raising 3 children who carried their mother's name into a world that would not, for a long time, understand what to do with it. The silence was of a different kind. It was the silence of a world that did not yet have the context to know what it had lost. When a person dies whose contribution belongs to a future that has not yet arrived, the loss is invisible in a specific way. It cannot be measured against what was actually built, because what was actually built does not yet exist. It can only be measured against what was written down, and what was written down was sitting in the archive of Taylor's scientific memoirs, under 3 initials, in a paper that the living scientific community had received with modest attention and then largely set aside. Ada was buried, as she had asked, in the church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, beside her father. The obituaries, such as they were, noted her connection to Byron more prominently than her connection to Babbage. She was, in the public record of her death, primarily the daughter of a famous poet who had done some mathematics. The notes waited in the archive. Babbage referenced them in his autobiography, published in 1864, with a generosity that the circumstances of his declining public standing made more significant rather than less. He quoted from them. He described Ada's contributions in terms that made clear he understood their value. But his autobiography reached a limited audience, and the analytical engine it described remained a design, and the broader world had limited reason to follow the thread back to the paper in Taylor's scientific memoirs. The analytical engine moved through the second half of the 19th century as an unresolved footnote to the history of technology. Babbage worked on it until his death in 1871, refining and extending the design with a persistence that had characterized his entire relationship with the machine. His son, Henry Prevost Babbage, constructed a small demonstration section after his father's death that performed calculations correctly when exhibited in the early 20th century. The complete machine was never built. The precision engineering it required was at the absolute limit of what Victorian manufacturing could achieve, and the sustained institutional commitment that would have been necessary to push past that limit was never assembled. The world built other things instead. The telegraph transformed communication across the latter half of the 19th century. Mechanical calculators, simpler than the analytical engine, but actually buildable, found their way into commercial use. Electricity arrived, and then the telephone, and then powered flight, and then the radio, each transformation building on the one before it. The pace of change accelerating through the decades that followed Ada's death in ways she had sensed were coming, without being able to specify the exact form they would take. None of it was precisely what she had described. All of it was moving, in ways that would only become clear in retrospect, toward something that was. The silence around her specific contribution was not absolute during these decades. Her name appeared occasionally in histories of mathematics and in accounts of Babbage and the analytical engine. The paper in Taylor's scientific memoirs was findable by anyone who looked for it, and some people did look. Scholars and historians trying to trace the intellectual lineage of ideas that were becoming increasingly important as the new century arrived. But the looking was scattered. The findings were not yet connected to each other in a way that produced the comprehensive recognition the work deserved. That recognition would require the arrival of the machines Ada had imagined. It would require the specific pressures of the Second World War and what those pressures made suddenly and urgently necessary to build. It would require a mathematician who would read the questions Ada had left open and find in them the central problem of his own work. And it would require a historian patient enough to go back to the archive and read the paper under 3 initials and understand what he was reading. The silence lasted just over 100 years. Then a door opened. It has not been closed since. Chapter 11. 100 years of silence. Then recognition. The 1950s were a decade of genuine uncertainty about what the new computing machines were and what they were going to become. The machines existed. That was no longer theoretical. The work done during the Second World War, at Bletchley Park in Britain, and in the laboratories that produced the first large-scale electronic computers in the United States, had demonstrated that electronic computation was not only possible, but practically powerful in ways that changed the nature of what could be calculated and how quickly. The machines coming out of that wartime effort were large and expensive and required specialist knowledge to operate. But they were real, and they were getting faster, and the people building them understood that what existed in 1950 was a beginning rather than a destination. What the people building them were less certain about was how to think about what they were building. The theoretical foundations of computer science were being assembled in real time, drawing on mathematics and logic and engineering in a combination that no existing discipline had previously required. The questions being asked were new in their specific form, even when they connected, as the most perceptive people in the field were beginning to recognize, to older philosophical territory. The older philosophical territory they connected to most directly was the territory that Ada had mapped in 1843 in a paper that almost no one building computers in 1950 had read. In 1950, Alan Turing published his landmark paper on computing machinery and intelligence. That paper, which proposed what is now called the Turing test as a way of approaching the question of machine intelligence, also contained a direct engagement with what Turing called Lady Lovelace's objection. The argument from Ada's notes that machines could only do what their operators knew how to instruct them to do, and therefore could not originate anything genuinely new. Turing took the objection seriously. He did not treat it as the speculation of a 19th century amateur operating without sufficient technical knowledge. He addressed it as the most substantive challenge to the possibility of machine intelligence that had been articulated anywhere in the available literature, and he worked through a response to it with the care that a serious argument deserves. His response acknowledged the genuine force of the objection against machines as they then existed. He then argued that the objection rested on assumptions about the fixed nature of machine behavior, that the development of learning machines would eventually require revising. A machine that could modify its own processes based on experience was doing something that the objection alone did not fully address. And the philosophical question of whether that difference constituted genuine origination remained genuinely open. Whether Turing's response resolved the objection is a question that remains open. What his engagement with it confirmed was that Ada, writing in 1843 in a world that had no electronic computers and no programming languages and no theoretical framework for computer science as a discipline, had identified a central philosophical tension in the field that Turing was helping to build a century later. 3 years after Turing's paper, a British scientist and educator named B.V. Bowden was preparing a book on the history and future of computing. Bowden went back to the original sources. He found Menebria's paper and Ada's translation and the notes. He read them carefully, and what he found was not a historical curiosity of modest significance. He found a document that addressed, with precision and conceptual depth that a century had not diminished, the fundamental questions about the nature and limits of computing that were being actively debated in the rooms around him. He reprinted Ada's translation and notes in his book, published in 1953 under the title Faster Than Thought. He attributed them, for the first time in a widely read publication, to Ada Lovelace by full name rather than by initials. 100 years after her death, the 3 initials finally had a name behind them. The debate that followed in the scholarly literature was not always generous, and the honest account requires engaging with it directly. Some historians argued that Ada had been primarily an expositor, a gifted communicator of Babbage's ideas rather than an independent contributor. They pointed to Babbage's own deep understanding of the analytical engine's capabilities and argued that Ada's notes, however well written, were essentially derived from his conception. Others argued the opposite. They pointed to the correspondence showing Ada holding firm against Babbage on the content of the notes. They pointed to the philosophical passages, particularly the discussion of the machine's limits, which went beyond anything Babbage had systematically articulated. They argued that the notes represented a genuine and independent intellectual contribution. The most careful historians who have examined the collaboration in detail, including Doran Swade at the Science Museum in London, who led the project to build a working difference engine from Babbage's original designs, have generally concluded that the truth is more interesting than either extreme position. The notes were collaborative in the sense that they emerged from an intellectual relationship rather than from isolated individual effort. They were also genuinely Ada's in the sense that the thinking in them, the philosophical reach, the conceptual framework, the specific arguments about the nature and limits of the machine, reflected a mind doing original work rather than transcribing someone else's. The distinction between a translator and a thinker matters. Ada was both. She was most significantly the second. The recognition built steadily through the 1960s and 70s as the growing community of computer scientists encountered for the first time the systematic history of their own field, and found in Ada's notes a document that connected the machines they were building to a tradition of thought that predated the electronic age by a century. Then, in 1975, the United States Department of Defense began a project to develop a single programming language that could serve as a standard across all military computing applications. The proliferation of different languages in military systems was creating compatibility and maintenance problems that were expensive and operationally significant. A unified language, properly designed and rigorously specified, would address the problem at its root. The project took several years. The language selected in 1979 needed a name. The name chosen was Ada. The choice was deliberate and considered. The people who made it understood the history they were invoking. They were naming a programming language after the person who had written what many in the field regard as the first published algorithm intended for execution by a machine. In a document that predated the programming language as a concept by more than a century, the Ada programming language became a standard in the most demanding computing environments in the world. Aircraft avionics, air traffic control systems, railway signalling, medical devices, the places where software must work correctly every time, where the margin for error is zero, have consistently turned to Ada. The name on the language was built into the infrastructure of the most critical computing applications in existence. A reminder in every line of code written in it of the person who had first understood what rigorous specification of a machine's instructions actually meant. The annual Ada Lovelace Day, first celebrated in 2009, established a recurring public recognition of women in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, using Ada's name and story as a focal point for a conversation about barriers and representation and what talent looks like when it is not permitted, the conditions it requires to fully express itself. Each of these recognitions added a layer to the public understanding of who Ada was and what she had done. What they did not fully resolve, and what the honest account requires acknowledging, is the tension between the Ada that the recognition has constructed and the Ada who actually existed. The Ada of the recognition is primarily a symbol, her life organized around a single achievement, her complications managed in service of that achievement's clarity. The symbol is true as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. The whole truth is the person who has been present across these chapters. The child who built wings and got sick and came back. The young woman who found in Babbage's machine the problem her entire formation had been preparing her to address. The mathematician who worked in the margins of a domestic life not designed to accommodate her and produced, in those margins, a document that a century of silence could not make obsolete. The person who struggled and pushed through and kept returning to the desk because the questions were still there and she was still the person who needed to address them. The symbol needs the complications to be worth anything. A person who only succeeded, who only saw clearly and worked without friction or failure, would be inspiring in the thin sense that distance produces, and useless in the substantive sense that genuine engagement requires. Ada was not thin. She was real. And real in a way that the archive documents, honestly enough that we can sit beside her in that drawing room and understand, from the inside rather than from the outside, what it cost her to do what she did. That understanding is worth more than any symbol. It always is. Chapter 12. What the modern world made of her name. There is a specific kind of posthumous fame that arrives so long after the person is gone that the person and the fame occupy entirely different worlds. Ada Lovelace died in 1852. The world that knows her name most widely is the world of the 21st century. The distance between those 2 points is not only chronological, it is the distance between a drawing room in London where a woman worked by candlelight in the hours before dawn, and a global technology industry that uses her name as a shorthand for something it values and sometimes understands and sometimes does not. The Ada programming language remains one of the most concrete and substantive honours attached to her name. It is not ceremonial. It is a working tool, used in environments where failure is not an acceptable outcome. Aircraft fly, guided by systems written in Ada. Medical devices operate on code that carries her name. The places where the cost of error is measured in lives rather than in inconvenience have consistently chosen the language named for the person who first understood what rigorous specification of a machine's instructions actually meant. The annual Ada Lovelace Day serves a different purpose and addresses a real need. The documented disparities in gender representation across science and technology fields represent a genuine cost to those fields. A straightforward loss of talent and perspective. Ada's story is used in this conversation as evidence that the barriers are constructed rather than natural. That a woman operating under constraints more explicit than anything existing in the modern technology industry produced work of genuine and lasting significance. The argument is sound, and the evidence it draws on is real. But using Ada as a symbol of inclusion, without simultaneously attending to the specific quality of her thinking, risks reducing the most interesting thing about her to a secondary feature of a story primarily about representation. Representation matters enormously, and Ada's contribution to computing is not primarily a contribution to the history of women in science. It is a contribution to the history of ideas. The two histories overlap in her case, and the overlap is significant. but they are not the same history, and collapsing one into the other loses something that neither history can afford to lose. The specific quality of her thinking is what makes Ada worth studying now, not as a symbol of what is possible, though she is that. As a practitioner of a specific and unusual kind of intellectual work, the work of asking what a new technology fundamentally is, not just what it does, but what it means, not just how it operates, but where its limits are, and what lies beyond those limits, and whether those limits are permanent or contingent on the specific form the technology currently takes. This kind of thinking is rarer in the modern technology industry than it should be. The industry is extraordinarily good at building things. It is considerably less practiced at asking the questions Ada asked. The ones about what the building means and where it leads, and what the machine can and cannot do when the instruction runs out. The artificial intelligence systems that now occupy the centre of that industry's attention are the most direct descendants of the questions Ada placed on the table in 1843. The large language models, the systems that learn from experience and produce outputs that sometimes surprise even the people who built them. All of them are living inside the territory that Ada mapped when she wrote about the relationship between what a machine is instructed to do and what it might be capable of doing beyond that instruction. Ada's objection has been tested by these systems in ways that Turing anticipated but could not have fully predicted. A language model that generates a sentence its creators never wrote presses on Ada's framework in ways that require careful examination. Is it originating something new? In the philosophical sense, her objection addressed, or is it executing, with extraordinary complexity and at enormous scale, a process that remains ultimately shaped by the patterns in its training data, which is to say, shaped by what human beings understood well enough to write down and make available? The honest answer, from the people who build these systems and from the philosophers who examine them most carefully, is that the question is genuinely open. The debate between those who argue that current artificial intelligence represents a qualitative break with Ada's objection, and those who argue that it is the most sophisticated implementation yet of exactly what Ada described, has not been resolved by the systems themselves. The systems are extraordinary. Whether they are extraordinary in the specific way that Ada's objection addresses is a question the systems cannot answer about themselves. This is the kind of problem that Ada, working by candlelight in a drawing room in the 1840s, would have recognized immediately as worth sitting down with, not because the specific technology would have been familiar to her, which it could not have been, but because the structure of the problem is exactly the one she identified, a machine doing things that are not yet fully understood, a gap between what the machine appears to be doing and what can be said with confidence about what the machine actually is, a need for someone to ask the right question in the right terms and hold the answer to the standard of something that would actually work. Ada set that standard in 1843. The field she anticipated is still working to meet it. Chapter 13. The question she left open. We began in a drawing room, not because we know exactly what that room looked like in the 1840s, with the specific quality of its light or the particular weight of its silence when the house had gone to sleep, but because the work Ada left behind invites us there, because the image of a person at a desk by a low candle, working on a question that no one around them has fully recognized as a question worth asking, is the truest image available of what the notes on the Analytical Engine actually were, and what the life that produced them actually cost. Ada Lovelace was not a saint. she would have found the description both inaccurate and faintly amusing. And her private correspondence is too direct and too honest about her own failings to support any version of her that removes the complications. She was a person who set a standard for herself and fell short of it regularly and kept working anyway. She was a person whose most important work was produced in conditions that were not designed to produce it, and who produced it anyway through the force of an attention that the world around her could not entirely extinguish. The question that the notes on the Analytical Engine placed before the world in 1843 was a question about the relationship between machines and minds, between what can be specified in advance and what emerges from the process of specification, between the instruction and what the instruction produces, and whether the gap between those two things is merely a gap of complexity or something more fundamental. Ada answered part of that question. She answered the part that belonged to the Analytical Engine as Babbage had designed it, with a precision and an honesty that the field she was anticipating has not needed to substantially revise in its essential terms. The machine could only do what its operators understood well enough to specify. The extension of human capability it offered was genuine and extraordinary, but the extension was bounded, in the end, by what the human mind had already understood. She left the rest of the question open, not because she could not see it, because she could. She could see, in the structure of the question she had just answered, the shape of the question she had not answered. What would it mean for a machine to extend beyond the understanding of the person who built its instructions? What would have to change? About the machine, or about our understanding of the machine, for the answer she had given to no longer hold. She could see that question clearly in 1843. She could not answer it, because the technology that would make the answer available did not exist in her lifetime, and would not exist for a century after her death. Alan Turing saw the same question in 1950, and named it the central problem of machine intelligence. The researchers who built the first neural networks were working on it. The teams that developed deep learning were working on it. The laboratories building systems that learn from experience and produce outputs that exceed what their creators explicitly specified are working on it now, in buildings that Ada could not have imagined, using methods that Turing could not have specifically predicted. The question has not been resolved. The technology has advanced in ways that press on Ada's answer with genuine force. The systems that exist today do things that would have appeared to Ada at her desk in the 1840s as both a confirmation and a complication of what she wrote. A confirmation because the extension of human capability through precisely specified instruction has been realized at a scale and with a power that far exceeds anything Babbage's drawings could have suggested. A complication because some of what the systems produce appears to go beyond the instruction in ways that Ada's framework does not straightforwardly account for. Whether the complication is deep enough to overturn the answer, or whether it is a more sophisticated expression of exactly what Ada described, is the live question. The one being worked on without consensus in the most serious research environments in the world today. The one that connects, in a direct and unbroken line, to a drawing room in London in the 1840s and a stack of papers covered in handwriting that moved between prose and mathematics the way a conversation moves between two languages. She opened that question under 3 initials, without a name attached, in a world that was not ready to receive what she had written. The drawing room is gone. The house is gone. The London that surrounded them has been replaced by a city that would be unrecognizable to the woman who lived and worked inside it. The question remains, It has been carried forward by everyone who encountered it and found it worth carrying. From Ada to Turing to the researchers who built the first computers to the people working today on what it might mean for a machine to understand rather than merely process. The candle that burned at that desk in the 1840s has never gone out in the sense that matters. The light it cast fell on a question that has been passed from one generation to the next, without anyone yet being able to say, with confidence, that they have finally answered it. Ada did not finish the answer. She did something harder and more valuable. She saw the question clearly, in the right terms. At the moment, when seeing it clearly was the most important thing that could be done, and she wrote it down with the precision and the honesty of someone who understood that a question stated badly is a question that cannot be answered at all. The desk is still there, in the sense that matters. The question is still open, in the sense that matters, and somewhere, tonight, in a laboratory or a study or a quiet room where everyone else has gone to sleep, someone is sitting with that question and pressing on the places where it resists and trying to understand what the resistance means. Ada would have recognized that person immediately. She would have known exactly what they were doing, and she would have understood, better than most, why the work at the desk in the quiet hours is worth doing, regardless of whether the answer arrives before the morning does.